The next paper is Intragenerational Wage Mobility and Inequality in Israel, Age and Gender Aspects, written by Miri Endeweld and Chaya Steyer. Chaya Steyer is Professor of Sociology and Labor Studies at Tel Aviv University. She served in a series of senior positions in the academic world. President of the International Sociological Association's Research Committee on Stratification, head of the Welfare Policy Program at the Taub Center in Israel, chair of the Labor Studies Department at Tel Aviv University, head of the Institute of Social Research at Tel Aviv University, and editor of Israeli Sociology Journal. Miri Endeweld is director of the Economic Research Division of the Research and Planning Administration at the National Insurance Institute. As part of her job, she conducts studies in socioeconomics, participates in committees and forums on these subjects, and prepares reports on poverty and social gaps. Please.
לא, אל תפתחי, אל תדעי. לא לגעת. רגע, אנחנו
Okay. Good morning and thank you for this opportunity. In our work, my work together with Professor Chaya Steyer, we address the issue of intra-generational wage mobility of young adults in Israel between 1990 to 2015. מישהו מסדר את זה?
הוא מטפל מפה, אז שנייה הוא מעלה את זה.
אוקיי.
רוצה שאני אעלה אותו מכאן?
מה? בסדר? טוב, אני לא. לא.
תפעיל אותי, יפתח, אני אוהב.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll start now. Job search theories suggest that the early labor market years are a period of rapid wage growth as well as an extensive job mobility. The wages of young people are expected to double along their careers, and they are likely to change jobs about 10 times in average. But the first 10 years of their career will account for 2/3 of their lifetime wage growth. We are interested especially in young people because in the United States as well as in other developed countries, it was found that the stagnation in wage in the recent years and even decades affected mainly young workers. Our investigated period from 1990 to 2015 is characterized by global and local changes which have led to abandonment of traditional labor relations, a decline in the power of trade unions, and an introduction of flexible work arrangements. Specifically in Israel, we have some main developments. The first one is the massive immigration from the Soviet Union in the early 90s. It affected all aspects of life in Israel and also, of course, the labor market. We also had increased exposure to import, sharpened the differences between industries, increase in the share of foreign labor starting in 2000, and a sharp decline in the percentage of unionized employees, especially in 1995 when the national health law took place, and the connection between the membership in sick funds and the membership in union trade has detached. We had also increase in employment rate and decrease in unemployment, as you have seen before. And in 2011, we had a social protest where more than 400,000 people, mainly young people, demanded social justice. Let me just read I want to read the typical headline from an economic newspaper from that time. Up to 187 salaries are needed for an apartment in Israel, only 30 in Sweden, and only 60 in the United States. So, in light of these developments, the purpose of our study is to examine and compare the wage trajectories of young people who entered the labor market at different points in time during the period investigated. We examine their absolute mobility, which means the wage growth, and the relative mobility, which means their location in the wage distribution, and how they changed during their first years of employment. We also compare the wage trajectories of different social groups of young people and different industries in order to understand whether changes in opportunities and working conditions contributed to the increased inequality and polarization in the Israeli society. The research is based on registered data from the tax authorities, and it includes the wage records and the number of months in each year, together with socio-demographic characteristics of the individuals. The study follows the wages of young people aged at the entry point 24 to 30, who entered the labor market at various points in time, 1991, 1995, 2000, 2005, and 2010, and examine their absolute and relative earnings mobility over the years up to 2015. All wage data were adjusted to 2015 prices, so that we talk about real changes and not nominal changes, and extreme values, too low and too high wages, were excluded in order to focus on the mainstream of the labor market. Some remarks about the method. As for the absolute mobility, we follow the real wage trajectories in 5-year intervals, as I said, for various time points. And for the relative mobility, we follow the change in deciles The deciles were calculated on the basis of entire wage distribution, so we can know the location of the young people in the whole wage distribution for each year. And we computed aggregative mobility indices such as correlation coefficients and the Shorrock's index, which I detail later. We also examined the probability of upward mobility by using logistic regressions. So let me turn now to the findings from the absolute mobility. Here we can see the average wage by gender groups in 5 years intervals. And please note to the first column of the initial wage, we can see that with the exception of 2000, we have more or less similar level of wages. In 2000, the Israeli economy had a very high growth, which affected the salaries. So we have a relatively high level of wage. We also can see that the gender gap is consistent between 30 to 35% between men and women. Here we can see the initial monthly wage of young adults as a percentage of GDP per capita. We can see that the initial wages declined consistently, especially for men, and also for women we have the same trend, but we have also stability for the middle periods. Also, if we control for the erosion compared to the GDP, and we compute the initial monthly wage of young adults as a percentage of the average wage in the economy, we can see the same trend of consistently declining of the wage. So we can say at this point that the situation of young people has deteriorated over time. Here we can see the wage increase rate after 5 working years for men and women. We can see that not only the initial wage of women are lower, but also their wage growth rate is also lower than that of men in all the period investigated. And here we see the cumulative increase rate in wages in 5-year intervals for the two gender groups. We see lower mobility among women in all intervals, and we can see that after 5 years we have 2 points of high increase in the wage. In 1995, it is we can explain it because it is from 1995 to 2000, and as I said before, we had a very nice economic year in 2000. So we have for men more than 100% of increase. But it is less easy to explain the high increase in 2010 to 2015, and maybe, I say it carefully, it could be a reaction to the protest of young people. One of the explanations. Of course, we should check all the factors, but one of the explanations could be the effectiveness of the protest in 2011. And here we see the wage growth of young workers entering the labor market in 1991 for during 25 years. We can see the stratification of young people, which is quite similar to the stratification for the Israeli society in general. In the high location, we can find the men, and afterwards immigrants and Jewish population, men and women in average. In the lowest, we can see the Arabs, and close to them, the ultra-Orthodox and the Ethiopian immigrants, as well as women. Also, we can see that the main mobility in terms of absolute mobility occurred in the first 10 years for most of the population groups. The figures, this figure shows the wage growth in all the time points we investigated. In comparison with men and in comparison of the gender groups, we use different scale because of the gap between the initial wages. But we can see that not only the initial wage, the slope of men is much higher than that of women in all the periods examined. Another pair, which we can see the same picture more or less, is the Arabs versus the Jews. We can see initial wage which is lower among the Arabs, and also a slope which is lower for the Arabs. And the immigrants, this is the picture, the figure of immigrants. They have a relatively nice wage growth in all the periods, as well as growth in the initial wage over time. And an additional pair is the high-tech workers industry versus the food and trade services. Of course, we can be impressed of the very nice growth of high-tech workers and the very steep slopes in all the periods. We can also see that for the food and trade services, we have they stayed in at the same level of initial wage in all the periods. 25 years, they stayed in the same initial wage. And of course, their slopes are less steeper significantly. And the public administration workers is an example. This is an example of workers which are which have a big part of unionized workers, and it is quite different from what we have seen so far. It is more arranged. The lines don't cross each other. And the difference in the initial wage, we have differences in the initial wages. It's relatively consistent growth. Here we can see the impact of education on mobility. We can use the education variables also only from 2000, because the ability, it was not available for a former period. And we can see that, as expected, the wage growth of educated is much more rapid than that of non-educated at every point in time, of course. But over time, the returns for education in terms of the initial wage decreased. The gap between educated and non-educated in 2000 is 25%, compared to only 7% in the third period in this slide. So we can see that they experienced a decrease in the return to education in these terms. Now I turn to the relative mobility. Here we compare 4 decades from 1991 to 2000, from 1995 to 2005, from 2000 and from 2005. We made the comparison for workers who had positive wages in the at least in the first year and in the last year of each decade. We computed correlation coefficients, 2 aggregative indices to see the mobility in a whole picture. One of them was the correlation coefficients for the deciles between the entry point and 10 years afterwards. And we have here Pearson and Spearman correlation coefficients, and we can see that from the first to the second period we had an increase in the correlation coefficient, which means decrease in the mobility. Then we have a stability, and then we have a decrease. It means that in the last in the fourth period we experienced increase in the mobility of young people. Also, when we compute the Shorrock's mobility, which measure the mobility in terms of inequality, this is the second row, we see more or less the same picture. We see that we had a decrease, a significant decrease in mobility from the first to the second period, and an increase and a return to the first period in the fourth period. We can see also that when we calculate the Gini coefficient for the average wage in the decades, we see that the inequality rose from the first to the second period and then decreased. So we know there is a debate in the literature about the connection between inequality and mobility, about the type or the sort of connection, and what we see from our data is that the connection is of a negative correlation. When the inequality increased, the mobility decreased, and vice versa. And here we can see the population groups from 1991 to 2015, but the relative job mobility, not the absolute wage mobility, because we had a similar slide earlier. And we can see here that the main relative mobility occurred in the first years. In the absolute mobility we saw 10 years, but here when we talk about relative mobility, it occurred in the first years, the main, and also almost stopped growing after 10 years. We see also that the stratification remained the same, and for the Arabs in the bottom, there is no floor effect. Their slope is flattest after 5 years, and also for the ultra-Orthodox to some extent. Here is the starting deciles and the increments in the deciles after 10 years by population groups in all the 4 decades. The low wage women, Haredim, Ethiopian, have generally a higher relative mobility, except for the Arabs. Again, when we talk about relative mobility, the Arabs ended up at the lowest decile in all decades, and the men ended up with the highest deciles, and what we also can see that immigrants enter in moderate levels but have the highest mobility. And when we see the same picture for the industries, we see that in the first period the high-tech entered with medium initial decile, but reached they had the high mobility, and later on the highest decile but moderate relative mobility. Overall, at the end of each period, they reach the highest location. Okay, I don't have the time, so I will skip this. Okay. Also we can see that in the health and education branch, we see a very low wage in the entry point, but a very high mobility. It could be explained by the fellows in the system, in the health system, as well as process of outsourcing for the education system. And here are the results from the logistic regression for upward relative mobility. We checked who made upward mobility from the first year to the last year of each decade in comparison of all periods. We could use the variables of education only for the last two periods because the availability of the data. And we can see that in the 90s and as well as the 2000s, controlling for initial decile, the low-wage population, women, Arabs, ultra-Orthodox, and Ethiopians, Ethiopians we will see later, have also a lower probability of upward mobility. For the high-tech industry, their advantage are less sharp in the 2000s, maybe because of the education variables that we could use for this period. Each work month raised the probability by 3% to 6% for all groups. That can teach us something about the consistency in the labor market. For education, chances for upward mobility are much higher for those with up to 3 academic years, and even more for those with more than 3 academic years. And here we can see the same compilation for Arabs and women. The odds ratios, something which is worth to say is that for Arab women we can see that their probability to upward mobility doubled between the two periods, but they still have much lower probability than that of Arab men. So to conclude, we saw that the worsening position of young people is in line with the public feelings and could partly explain the outbreak of the social protest in 2011. We saw that this trend has indeed begun to be somewhat restrained during the period of 2010 to 2015. Overall, the findings suggest a growing polarization consistent with the skill bias of the labor market, with higher wages and faster wage growth among the highly educated and especially in high-tech industries. These trends could explain in part the growing gender differences in mobility patterns, as women are less likely to enter technical occupations, and it could explain also the growing inequality between Jews and the Arabs in the Israeli society. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to call Professor Marcus Yanati to discuss the paper of Chaya and Miri, and after it introduce his paper. Marcus Yanati is Professor of Economics at the Swedish Institute for Social Research at Stockholm University. His research centers on income and wealth inequality, poverty and socio-economic mobility. He has recently devoted attention to trying to understand and quantify the importance of family background in the distribution of economic resources. Professor Yanati, please. We have the discussion after introducing both.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper. I realized after delivering these slides yesterday to the organizers that I've probably approached this in the wrong way for this particular conference. I get a paper and I'm asked to comment. I tend to approach it like a referee or editor of an academic journal, and not necessarily primarily from a policy perspective, which probably would have been more appropriate right now. But let me start by saying that it's an enjoyable paper to read. It's the first I've seen on Israel using administrative records to look at mobility. And it also gets the prize for having the most empirical results per paragraph that in a paper I've seen in a very long time. It's very densely packed with stuff. And in fact, my main comment is going to be that I mean, there might be enough material here for a lifetime of academic research, but at least a large number of papers can, and in my view, in fact, should be written on this, on the basis of the different approaches that are present in the paper. So I was kind of reading this as the beginning of a multi-year research program on mobility. In fact, that was I'll have more to say on that in a minute. Let's see now. This thing is not doing exactly what I'd hoped for, so let's go here. So this Miri and Chaya's paper has a focus on wage mobility among young workers who are young in both the sense of having a young age and young in the sense of having no prior labor market experience, or at least no labor market involvement in the year prior to entering the data set. It covers a period from the early 1990s to 2015, and there's a periodization of five years. So the youngsters are followed for 5, 10, and 15 years. And again, there's, as I said, every single paragraph has at least 2 interesting results. So, but one of the striking things is the real incomes of the young workers do grow as they age, but across the period there's remarkably little shift in these profiles, which, given that Israel has gone through many different phases of the environment that these youngsters face, is kind of remarkable that there's kind of very little shift going on. Relative mobility, as captured by the Shorrock's index, is U-shaped. The differences aren't probably all that huge, but there is a decline and then an uptick again to the same level as when it started. But one of the things that is quite striking is there's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity in income growth that both these cohorts and the different groups face. And what you tend to find, in fact, one of the things I find interesting in contrasting inequality and mobility studies is that there's almost like this, I think Larry Katz used the term a fractal character when discussing the late 1980s surge in labor market inequality or labor income inequality in the US, that things look very similar regardless of how you look at it. One of the things you find in mobility is that compared to inequality, the very same groups are at risk of low income and bad mobility outcomes. So things look very similar when you increase the time span. And this you can see here. So the vulnerable groups fare worse as time goes by. Now, my main comment is that I'm an economist, and we're simple people, so we tend to think. In fact, the analogy I thought of during the presentation is that this is a very dense portrait of mobility of young workers in Israel. And it's easier to think in terms of stories. But when you're telling a story, you really kind of need one main storyline, which means that you'd need to separate these things into multiple different papers. There are very many interesting papers here, so it's wonderful news, so to speak, even though it's going to take some time. And in fact, what I do, or what I'd encourage you to do, of course, depending on which discipline you're going to go for, is that I'd try to organize the stories along different mobility concepts. So I'd kind of tend to separate the real income changes into one paper. Then I'd do the transition matrices, positional change things in a different paper. And as a third paper, I'd talk about income risk. And this kind of gets me into... in fact, let's do this one first. I worked with Stephen Jenkins on a paper on income mobility, both intra and intergenerational mobility some years ago for the Handbook of Income Distribution. And one of the things that struck Stephen and myself when we were doing this is that people talk about mobility, but they mean a large number of different things with mobility. And we identified, I mean, you can do this in many ways, but we identified several different ones. There's mobility as positional change, of changing places in the distribution. There's mobility as individual income growth, often in real terms, but possibly in relative terms as well. There's mobility as inequality reduction, and then there's mobility as income risk. And in fact, all of the first three are represented in this paper, but I think it would clarify things if they were separated in different pieces. And then the income risk thing isn't quite as prominent there, and in fact I'd encourage you to take a look at that as well. And the reason these concepts matter is that, again, this struck Stephen and myself, that whether or not mobility is considered a good thing, both in theory and in practice, depends on what kind of mobility you're looking at. So the income risk interpretation, we tend to think mobility is possibly a bad thing. The income growth part, we tend to think of mobility as primarily a good thing. On the positional change thing, the jury's out, it kind of depends. But the implications of all of these can be quite different. So again, I just encourage you, in a sense, when you're organizing this great wealth of material to possibly, I mean, this is one way. If you go for a more public policy, economics-oriented journals, this would be what I'd encourage you to do, to separate them in these ways. Now, I have a few more specific comments. One is that this is mainly, but not only, focused on young workers, in that I understand when you look at the deciles, you define the decile limits, including all workers, and not only young ones. And in fact, one of the strands you might take is to do more of young workers' labour market experiences relative to those of the older ones. I think it would be useful to have more descriptive information on the types of persons who are entering into the data, because at the lower limit is age 24, and it's very different if you're entering at age 24 because you've had a few young children and you're entering the labor force for that reason, or you're entering the labor force because you just got a degree in engineering. So characteristics, and in particular how that composition, just out of the army, but then they're back in again. It's, but all the same, all these kinds of different, and how that composition changes across time would be interesting, because of course the interesting thing is that the starting point doesn't really budge much at all, but I presume that the composition of those entering does change, which kind of creates something of a puzzle. But it would be good to know more about this. The focus on those with no earnings in the prior year, this is the kind of thing as an editor I'd suggest sensitivity analysis with this, because again, the reasons for not having earnings in the year prior might be different, and that may say a lot. So did these people first work, then drop out of the labor force, and then re-enter, or were they out of university and so on? So knowing more about these would be good. And the final comment addresses this issue of income risk. So it would be nice to know if these trajectories are associated with different trajectories of the income risks associated with them across time as well. In a sense, thinking of the labor market participation as being a risky investment. There's a mean return, and then there's a variation of that return across that risk. So knowing how that changes across time is interesting from the income risk perspective as well. So that was what I had to say. Thank you.